All right, the next astronomer we're going to talk about is one of the most interesting characters in history as far as astronomy goes. His name is Tycho Brahe. And literally, he was an interesting character. He lived from 1546 to 1601. Okay? In fact, we know exactly when he died in 1601 because there were journals kept of what happened to him at the end. I'll talk to you about a little bit about that. But Tycho was a true astronomer. You got to think of him like Hipparchus. He just wanted to spend all his nights figuring out stars, trying to understand them, and trying to figure out how the solar system worked. They knew that the current ideas weren't working. He had read Copernicus's book, and he believed that that was probably true, but he believed that the evidence had to show it. It wasn't just, oh, I believe the sun's at the center. It's like, I have to observe that to do that. And he realized that most of the data that people were looking at, like the data that Copernicus was looking at, was actually Hipparchus's data as written by Ptolemy, which was over 1,000 years old. Nobody had done a lot of new data. And the only way he could do a better job was to collect better data. So he had to figure out how to collect the position of the planets and stars very accurately over many, many years, like a decade or more, and then he could start to figure out how the solar system worked, and that was his goal. Now, he was not wealthy, but he hung around with all the wealthy people. He was kind of a middle class, upper middle class, but he would go to kings and say, look, I'm a great astronomer. He would sell himself. He was very flamboyant, wore elaborate clothing, and would say, I'm this great astronomer. I'm going to make all these discoveries, and if I do it in your country, look how famous you will become. Can you give me money to buy my instruments and set it up? And he did this. He did it twice because one country he actually got kicked out of. All right, and then he ended up in Denmark on an island, and he created and he designed his own instruments, very elaborate instruments. And he was a superb astronomer. Now remember, the telescope had still not been invented, so everything he did was done with just your naked eye. But he had elaborate instruments to measure the position. He had started to get elaborate clocks, because astronomy is all about time. And he started observing the sky. What are some of the things that he found? Well, in 1572, let me do this in a different color here. He saw a new star. Or what we would call now a supernova. In fact, he invented the term nova. Nova is Latin for new. So a new star was a nova. Okay? And now we realize now it's a supernova. In fact, we call it Tycho supernova. It's named after him. A supernova is when a massive star, there is no A there, sorry, it's just supernova. When a star blows up, a star that's much more massive than the sun, when it ends its life, is going to blow up in a spectacular explosion. When it does that, that star gets very, very bright for several months, and then it'll fade off, and then you won't see it at all again. Okay? All right. This was critical. Why? Because the current view of society, which was the view of the Catholic Church at the time, was that the sky, the heavens, were different than the earth. What happened on the earth were some rules that the earth had, but the heavens were perfect. And if the heavens were perfect, that's why they believed everything had to be in perfect circles, because a circle is the most perfect shape. And they were unchanging, that they'd been perfect forever, and all the stars have always been, always were, would never change. And all of a sudden he said, no, look, there is a star that wasn't there before that is now there. And then it faded away, and then it went away. So stars come and go. Not only that, he knew that it wasn't part of our atmosphere. Up until then, things that were changed in the sky, like comets and meteors and stuff, they always claim, oh, those are atmospheres, so they're really still part of the earth. But he looked and he said, no, that's not true, because I can't see parallax to this new star. Remember what parallax was? That allowed you to see the distance. He says, I can't see parallax. It has to be at least beyond the moon, because you can see parallax of the moon. And so he saw a new star. This new star came and went, And that was one of his great discoveries. All right. He measured the position and accuracy of planets. And he did it to about 1 arc second. 1 arc minute of accuracy. That is pretty much the absolute you can do with your naked eye. You cannot do any better than that with limited by our vision. Now, the only way to get better is you have a telescope, but he didn't have a telescope. So his data was superb. He did this for over 20 years. He collected data. He collected data on the position of stars, on the position of all the planets for 20 years, and from that, he then realized, okay, now I have enough data, I can try to figure out how this is working. And I have really good data, much better than the data that the Greeks had from Hipparchus' day. All right. He had then calculated the length of a year, calculated length of the year, to within 1 second. So he knew exactly how long it took to go around to within 1 second. That accuracy of calculating the length of the year helped them when they redid the calendar. Remember, in the 1600s, after Brahe had done this, they went to the Gregorian calendar under Pope Gregory. They incorporated this new data into it, so our calendar is more accurate. It stays more in sync with the seasons. Okay? And he looked but could not see. He says he never found parallax of stars. Same thing that Aristotle looked for. He looked for with better eyes and better instruments. He still never found the parallax of stars. And so he said, oh, well, if I can't find parallax of stars, then probably the Earth isn't moving. So he created his own model of the solar system. It was very complicated because he said the Earth is still at the center and not moving. But to make it simpler, here's the sun out here. Sun goes around, but everything else goes around the sun. So he believed in the Copernicus' view, but instead of pointing your pin on the sun and everything go around it, you put the pin on the Earth, the sun goes around the Earth, but then everything else gets dragged around the sun. So Mercury and Venus go around the sun, and then Mars goes around the sun, outside the Earth, and then Jupiter goes out here, Saturn goes out there. So the Earth is fixed, these are all going around the sun, and the sun is carrying them around the Earth. Complicated model, but he did that because he still never found parallax of stars. The problem they had is the problem that we found out much later, is that nobody could really imagine how far stars were away. There is parallax of stars, but that number is so small that even the closest star to us only has parallax of about 1 arc second, or 1/160th of an arc minute. He can't see that. And they just couldn't imagine the stars were really that far away. And I don't even know if we can today. Imagining the actual distance to stars is just something beyond human comprehension. That number is just so big. All right, so Tycho did this, and I have a drawing of Tycho, what he looked like. Now, Tycho's story is interesting too, because he was the character. He would get in duels. In fact, he got in a duel, you know, back then was in somebody said something to you and it made you angry. You would say, oh, I'll challenge you to a duel, and you whip your gloves in his face. During a duel with sabers, he got the end of his nose cut off. You see this right here? So then he had a gold and a silver nose that he made that he could wear on his nose to cover up the fact that the end of it was cut off. So when he was going to a fancy banquet with the king, he would wear his gold nose. He was known to party very heavily. He liked to go drink and liked to hang out, especially with royalty. This is his actual signature, right here. Okay. And this is a painting of supposedly what his workshop looked like. And this is really neat here because what you see is he created this elaborate instrument here, really big, and he could slide this up and down, and he could look through this little hole and see a star, and he could tell exactly the angle of that star, how far it is, what its altitude was, and if he had an exact clock, which they have down here, he would know exactly what time it is. He essentially figured out the right ascension and declination of all the stars. He had a huge 6-foot globe that he plotted the position of all these stars on. He had people that would come and go and work for him. He created what they call armillaries, which showed the position and motion of the stars and the planets. He was really a great astronomer. Now, was he a great person? Not really, because he also did things that we would find very questionable nowadays. He had a pet dwarf named Zepp that would come and he would feed him table scraps. Stuff that is just completely incorrect nowadays. He tended to get away with it back then. All right, but Tycho Brahe's goal of figuring out exactly how the planets in the solar system moved and how it all worked, he never got to. That was for the next guy. So go to the next video.